You should see this popping up on your screen about that.
All right. Well, thank you for attending my dissertation defense to change everything. We need everyone, belonging, equity, and diversity in the U.S. climate movement. I've been working on this for 6 years. This presentation is an overview. It's about 25 minutes, so I apologize. A lot of details have been omitted for brevity, but I hope it inspires you to want to learn more from my full dissertation and other resources that I will share throughout the presentation. And one more piece of housekeeping. In the chat, I provided a link that's like a sign-up sheet. So if you give me your name and email, then I can send you the slides or whatever resources people would like. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So first, I want to appreciate everyone who helped me on this journey. My advisory committee, Abby Abrash-Walton, Jason Rhodes, Carolyn Finney, and Marcelo Banta. My research assistants, Jess, Emily, Ben, Phoebe, and Matt, and the organizations that helped funding this research, as well as participating in the research. I'm going to start with setting the context of the US climate movement. As the climate crisis intensifies, more Americans are becoming active on climate change. In 2021, the Pew Research Center estimated that 24% of US adults made efforts to support climate action, including donating money to climate organizations, contacting elected officials, volunteering, and attending protests or rallies. What started as a few student groups has turned into a global social movement encompassing people from all walks of life. Despite this remarkable growth, racial diversity in the US climate movement is not representative of the US population. According to the 2020 US Census, the US is 59.3% white, 18.9% Latino, 13.6% Black, 6.1% Asian, 2.9% mixed race, and 1.3% American Indian and Alaska Native. In the same year, the Climate Action Campaign conducted a study of the demographics of the climate movement by matching their members to their voter profiles. They found that the combined membership of the 20 US climate organizations was 83% white, 7% Latino, 5% Black, 2% Asian, and 0% Native American or other. When it comes to the staff of environmental organizations, from 2017 to 2022, the percentage of people of color grew from 25% to 36.5%. The percentage of BIPOC senior staff increased from 17% to 33.4%. And the percentage of BIPOC heads of organizations grew from 25 to 30%. As you can see, racial diversity has improved a lot in the staff of environmental organizations, but not as much in the general climate movement. Why are we concerned with racial diversity? Why does equity lead with race? In the United States, people are marginalized by their gender, sexual orientation, class, and other factors, but race continues to be the greatest predictor in all indicators of progress and well-being. Consider this fact. In 2019, non-Hispanic white householders had a median household wealth of $187,000, compared with $14,000 for Black householders and $31,000 for Hispanic householders. When you have less wealth, you have fewer resources to deal with climate disasters, live in a safe area, and have access to good schools and other benefits of society. By prioritizing race in climate resilience, we address the root causes of inequity while also addressing factors such as income/wealth, gender, and disability that worsen racial inequality. Leading with race does not mean only race, but it is a way of taking into account the profound impact that racism, including slavery, Native American genocide, and racial exclusion, has had on every aspect of American life. Second, climate change affects everyone, but disproportionately impacts people of color. According to the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, 58% of Hispanics and 55% of Black Americans say climate change is harming them personally, compared to 38% of whites. Like in many social movements, those who are the most affected have the most motivation to address the problem and have solutions that would work for their community. Third, people of color are more concerned about climate change than whites and are also more likely to take action. The Yale Program on Climate Change Communication found that more than 1 in 3 Latinos and African Americans say they would definitely or probably join a campaign fighting climate change, compared to 1 in 5 whites. In addition to the reasons cited above, Diversity brings strategic advantages to climate organizations. Diversity helps environmental organizations appear more connected to communities, increase creativity, and bring in additional funding networks. More than 50% of the environmental NGO leaders believe that diversity also increases productivity, creates more genuine meritocracy, and produces better management-employee relations. Finally, racism doesn't just harm Black, Indigenous, and people of color, but everyone. Heather McGhee calls this principle drain pool politics in her book, The Sum of Us. She describes how for a time in American history, cities and towns competed to provide their residents with public amenities that promoted civic pride and symbolized a perk of the American dream. One example is the Fairground Park pool in St. Louis, the largest public pool in the US when it was built in 1919. It featured sand from a beach, a fancy diving board, and enough room for up to 10,000 swimmers. These public pools, of course, were for whites only. But when civil rights integrated them, many cities either sold the pools to private entities, or in the case of Fairground Park, closed them down for good. McGhee employs the metaphor of a drained, cracked public pool to make a larger point. White refusal to share resources that should be available to all Americans doesn't just hurt people of color, it hurts them too. Drain pool politics explains why the US does not have a universal healthcare system, why public schools are underfunded, why efficient public transit is non-existent in most American cities, and why we continue to delay action on climate change. Okay, I'm going to talk about some theoretical framework. To begin the work of inclusion and justice, we need to understand the relationship between race, racism, and power. Critical race theory is the study of how race shapes our perceptions of reality. It posits that race is intentionally built into the laws and legal institutions of the US. Systemic racism continues to marginalize people of color in every aspect of our society. Critical race theory is dedicated to the eradication of systemic racism and other unjust hierarchies. Critical race theory also gives us a framework of the 4 levels of racism: personal, interpersonal, institutional, and structural. Personal refers to private beliefs, prejudices, and ideas that individuals have about the superiority of whites and the inferiority of people of color. Among people of color, it manifests as internalized oppression. Among whites, it manifests as internalized racial superiority. Interpersonal refers to the expression of racism between individuals. It occurs when individuals interact and their private beliefs affect their interactions. Institutional refers to discriminatory treatment, unfair policies and practices, inequitable opportunities, and impacts within organizations and institutions based on race that routinely produce racially inequitable outcomes for people of color and advantages for white people. Structural refers to a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequality. It is racial bias among institutions and across society. It involves the accumulation and compounding effects of an array of social factors, including the history, culture, ideology, and interactions of institutions and policies that systemically privilege white people and disadvantage people of color. Critical race theory often shows how having a marginalized identity puts you in a position of disadvantage in society. The standpoint theory, a feminist theoretical perspective that emerged from critical theory, posits that having a marginalized identity actually puts you at the advantage of greater perspective and even belonging in society. And the more marginalized identities you have, the more privilege you have in terms of perspective and belonging. In the book You Belong, Sebene Selassie described it as the following. Imagine society as a series of concentric circles where the inner circles represent the center and the outer circles represent the margins. If we imagine each circle is made up of people who are facing inwards, the closer you are to the center, the less you see, with the innermost circle seeing the least, but making the most of the official decisions for all circles. Conversely, if you are in the outermost circles, you have the greatest perspective, the little power over systemic decisions. Also, the people from the outer circles not only see more, they actually visit the center by traveling the radius from edge to center, from outside in. Center inhabitants rarely travel to the outer circles. Some start at the margins but are moved to the center through colonization, migration, education, or profession. We are conditioned to believe that proximity to the center is a measure of our belonging, but actually being on the margin enables you to encompass more of the whole of society. If we apply this theory to the climate movement, people of color and those with marginalized identities provide unique perspectives, that are invaluable for the climate movement. For example, climate activists and professionals with direct experience of environmental injustice have a connection to the communities they are trying to help and perspective that their white counterparts do not have. Being able to hold both the perspectives of the marginalized and white dominant culture enables people of color to be better communicators and innovators on climate change. So the words frequently used to indicate our aspirations include belonging, equity, justice, diversity, and inclusion. I have come to see this as 3 goals and 2 practices. The 3 goals are belonging, equity, and diversity, and the 2 practices are inclusion and justice. Belonging is the state of relation in which we are able to be our whole selves with others. The conditions of belonging include being present, invited, welcome, known, accepted, supported, heard, befriended, needed, and loved. Equity is the equal and fair distribution of opportunities, resources, and environments free from climate hazards and risks, regardless of individual/group identity or background. Diversity refers to psychological, physical, and social differences that occur among any and all individuals, including but not limited to race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, socioeconomic status, education, marital status, etc. Inclusion is the act of creating environments in which any individual or group can be welcomed, respected, supported, and valued to fully participate where differences are embraced. Justice is the proactive and reinforcement of policies, practices, attitudes, and actions that produce equitable power, access, opportunities, treatment, impacts, and outcomes for all. Racial justice leads to the actualization of racial equity. So in this framework, the 2 practices lead to the realization of the 3 goals of belonging, equity, and diversity. To help us understand belonging, I like to show this illustration from Dr. Eric Carter. On the left, exclusion is represented as a homogeneous conglomeration of individual white balls where marginalized groups are invisible. In segregation, a small group of colored balls appear next to the white balls, indicating that the marginalized group is segregated from the mainstream group. In integration, the collection of colored balls is integrated into the white balls, but they remain a distinct group in the community. Farther along in inclusion, the colored balls are dispersed throughout the community, indicating a more embedded presence, though the colored balls remain distinct. Finally, belonging is represented by all the balls being colored, which doesn't mean that there are no white individuals, but rather everyone is recognized as a unique individual and there is no distinction of an in-group or an out-group. As our understanding of equity and community relations advances, we may discover stages beyond belonging that manifest equity even more profoundly. So in summary, achieving belonging requires all of the elements to be present, invited, welcomed, known, accepted, supported, cared for, befriended, needed, and loved. Now moving on to my study, starting with methods. The questions I explored in my research were, who are part of the climate movement? How are BIPOC and white climate activists different? What are the challenges and barriers to engagement? What resources help BIPOC overcome the barriers to participation? And what can organizations do to improve diversity, equity, and belonging? The methods I used for this study were a literature review of peer-reviewed articles, reports, and organizational DEI documents, a survey of 1,003 participants, and interviews with 17 BIPOC climate activists and professionals working in the fields of climate policy, advocacy, adaptation, and implementation. I used a participatory action research method where the climate action organizations were involved in the design of the research questions and helped to recruit participants. Each of the participating organizations were provided with their own survey results, which they used to inform their DEI strategic plan. All right, so some results. Demographics. The respondents in my survey were 70% white, 59% women, 46% over 55, 83% progressive, and 89% middle class. So this is consistent with other studies of the demographics of the climate movement. Some differences I found were that people of color tended to be younger, lower social and economic class, and involved for less time in climate organizations than the white climate activists. Whites were more likely to contact their elected officials about climate change. There was no significant difference between whites and people of color in how frequently they met with the elected officials about climate change, talked to their friends and family about climate change, participated in demonstrations on climate, or volunteered on activities for climate change. In terms of impacts, People of color most frequently mention direct climate impacts, such as heat, fire, flood, drought, and sea level rise. Whites most frequently mention mental health impacts, such as depression, anxiety, fear, and stress. In terms of worries, people of color were most worried about government inaction, extreme weather, and inequality, whereas white people were most worried about future generations, government inaction, and harm to wildlife and ecosystems. The participants discussed many challenges and barriers to their participation in the climate movement. The interpersonal challenges were being complimented for their intelligence, knowledge, and engagement on climate, being ignored, dismissed, questioned, and challenged regarding their expertise and contributions, being intentionally or unintentionally excluded, being underappreciated, not recognized, or rewarded for their work, being otherized for their culture, and experiencing intersectional challenges with being a woman, young, from another culture, or other marginalized identity. The general, or another way to put it, the institutional systemic barriers that people faced were lack of representation, lack of organizational commitments to DEI, tokenism, market-based solutions, unexamined white privilege, environmental injustice, lack of access in education, communication barriers, age, and inadequate human resources. Participants often mentioned white supremacy culture as a barrier. The characteristics of white supremacy culture are defined as paternalism, power hoarding, urgency, perfectionism, one right way, either or binaries, denial and defensiveness, individualism, quantity over quality, worship of the written word, right to comfort, and fear of conflict. Participants were asked what resources helped you overcome the challenges and barriers, what strategies helped you cope. Their responses were mentors, funding, BIPOC colleagues and affinity groups, programs that promote BIPOC in the environmental field, finding workplaces that prioritize DEI, leaning in, humor, focusing on the positive, not taking things personally, learning about DEI, self-care, culture, and hobbies. The strategies they recommended for improving internal DEI included working from an equity lens, accountability and data, training, human resources, more BIPOC representation and leadership, resources for employees, programs supporting BIPOC, supporting youth, and countering white supremacy culture. The strategies they recommended for external DEI included shifting the framing on climate change towards environmental justice, uplift BIPOC engagement, co-designing solutions and strategies with frontline communities, mutually beneficial partnerships, and building relationships. The resources they said organizations needed to succeed in creating belonging, equity, and diversity were more DEI personnel, funding, non-monetary resources, incentives, external consultants, access to learning materials, and willingness to do the work. So in my dissertation, I have a lot of really excellent quotes that the participants said. So didn't have time to include them all in here, but they are really wonderful. And it's a chance for you to hear directly from the participants in the interviews. So you can do that. All right, so in my conclusion, I will talk about the implications of my research for theory, practice, and further study. So how do we go from a world of exclusion and inequity to one of belonging, equity, and diversity? One of the more popular theories of social change is Bill Moyer's movement action model of social movements. MAP describes the progress of social movements in 8 stages. Normal times, prove the failure of official institutions, ripening conditions, trigger event and takeoff, perception of failure, majority public opinion, success, and continuing the struggle. MAP emphasizes that social movements are a long process happening over years and decades. Periods of success are followed by periods of retrograde. Activists have agency over the progress of social movements. From a critical race perspective, we can revise MAP in the following ways. Normal times were never normal for the oppressed. They were just tolerating it. Buildup of stress happens when people realize that change needs to happen and can happen. The oppressed take the lead in making things happen. The trigger event is one in which tolerance reaches a breaking point. The oppressed realize that they have far more to gain by taking action than they have to lose. This is what happened after the death of George Floyd. Public awareness is when everyone joins them in creating change. And in the era of social media, this can happen overnight. Backlash is a sign that we are winning. Success is usually incremental. The journey of progress is long, not just decades, but centuries. The work we're doing now is building the foundation for future generations to continue the work. So there were lots of implications for practice in what I gathered from the study. What strategies can organizations employ to practice inclusion and justice? So first, 3 key points. VEGI is an iterative process. We have to continually evaluate the strategies and improve them and implement them and measure them. It requires commitment and accountability. And leadership is very important in moving the work forward. First, that leaders have to be really committed to give resources and be held accountable. And this is also helped if the leaders are BIPOC themselves, which is the change is not happening as fast as diversity among the staff. The recommendations I gleaned are frame climate change as a present-day crisis, as local, intersectional, and as a racial justice issue. Emphasize efficacy, tailor strategies to specific groups, address oppression as intersectional, address mental health and burnout, build authentic relationships, build community and belonging, apply a racial justice lens, engage young people, and invest resources in VEGI. So my work had explored many aspects of the climate movement. However, there were aspects that could be more successfully studied if there were more time and resources. In terms of demographics, we don't have a good sense of the demographics of the climate movement. Organizations often don't collect this data or they don't share it. Diversity at different levels. We need to understand and promote diversity, not just of the foot soldiers, but also in leadership at different levels. Specific demographic groups. There is a lot of diversity within people of color as well as whites. We need specific studies on African Americans, Muslims, Asians, LGBTQ, and other less studied groups. Justice, equity, and belonging. Most studies have focused on diversity, and we need more studies on how justice, equity, and belonging show up in the climate movement. Challenges and barriers, collecting more personal stories from BIPOC and understanding how barriers are intersectional. Resources and strategies. We can study what strategies are being employed and how well are their strategies working. What are the implications? So finally, a vision for the future. Why do we do this work? What's the future we are fighting for? Let's imagine a climate movement in which the people who are most affected are most represented and involved in decision-making, where the changes we fight for reduce inequality as well as carbon emissions, where people are treated with fairness and dignity and are appreciated and valued for their contributions, including with equitable compensation, a movement where everyone is able to contribute with their authentic selves, where artists and poets are valued as much as scientists and policymakers, a movement that inspires hope, joy, community, and belonging, a movement that is successful because everyone wants to be a part of it and it is easy to make a difference. Each of us needs to do the work of transformation, but we cannot stop there. The work of liberation is work that needs to be done in community. As the great civil rights leader Fannie Lou Hamer said, nobody is free until everybody is free. So I omitted many of the details in this presentation. So I encourage you to check out my full dissertation or past presentations that I have made on this topic. I will be uploading them to my website, climatediversity.org, where you can find additional resources. If you're interested in doing this work with your organization, you can hire me for speaking, research, and consulting. And if you would like to support my work, you can donate through Venmo or PayPal. Funds will go towards maintaining the website, outreach, and volunteering for organizations that support BIPOC working in climate. Okay, that's the end. Thank you, everyone.